pulled it out of her oven. Lisa sat down in the chair, took off the lid to the roasting pan, and I was met with the source of that terrible smell. Inside the pan was a pot roast with carrots, potatoes, and gravy, but it was all covered in mold. I gasped and froze at the sight of it. "Your favorite, right, Daryl?" Lisa said again as she reached for the ladle and scooped 2 large helpings onto the plate in front of her cat. I watched in horror as she then turned to me and did the same. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe, knowing now where that smell had been coming from. I felt Jim kick my leg. Our eyes locked. Lisa continued serving the rotten roast to Jim, and finally, to herself. I stared at my plate. In the dim light and the heat of Lisa's apartment, I made out tiny white maggots, hundreds of them, crawling out from between the layers of meat and vegetables. The meat had turned green, and the vegetables were slimy. I shut my eyes and covered my mouth and nose with my one hand. It was all I could do to keep from throwing up. Something was wrong with Lisa. My eyes shot back open when I heard a clatter. Jim had practically fallen out of his chair and was scrambling towards the door. "Jess, we're going, now," he said in a stern and terrified voice. I opened my eyes and bolted up from the chair. I felt Jim grab my hand as he said, "Don't look, just go." My body did exactly the opposite. As we grabbed our shoes and wrenched the door open, I took a quick look behind me. Something to this day I wish with all my heart I had not done. When I looked back, I saw Lisa's cat, with its face to the plate, devouring the dish in front of him. But even more disturbing was Lisa, sitting there chewing away on the maggot-infested roast, a huge smile on her face as she looked at the cat and said, "I know, Daryl, it's my favorite too," before shoveling a heaping fork full of the putrid meat into her mouth. Jim and I ran upstairs and spent the next half an hour puking. After that, we couldn't eat for 2 weeks, and I ended up throwing out the clothes we had worn into the apartment, because no matter how much we washed them, I couldn't seem to get that smell out. That evening, once we had stopped vomiting, and we were able to calm down enough to talk, Jim called emergency services and told them what had happened. He said that our neighbor was unwell, and that they should send an ambulance as well as someone from social services to check on the elderly woman. A couple days later, we received news that Lisa had been taken to the emergency room that night, and then died soon after, in the hospital. Her funeral was being held the following weekend, and we were encouraged to attend, as she didn't have much family left. On the day of the funeral, Jim and I were still unable to eat. We had been living on coffee, water, and saltine crackers since the night we went over there for dinner. We had scrubbed every inch of the house, opened the windows, and had 3 scented candles burning almost constantly. We mustered the courage out of respect for our neighbor and headed to the memorial service. We walked into the mostly empty room at the funeral home to pay our respects. Looking at the face of Lisa as she lay there in her coffin, I couldn't help but wonder what happened to her. Why had such a kind old lady gone so far off the deep end, so suddenly? Had her brother Daryl recently died, and maybe she couldn't handle the grief? Had it been a stroke? We were never given an answer from anyone on what actually happened, but we did learn one thing at the memorial service. While reading through her obituary, I noticed that there was no Daryl listed at all in Lisa's family. In fact, she only had one sister who had died of breast cancer in her 50s, 30 years prior to this. I mentioned this to Jim on the way home, and we could agree that it was best to not think about it. We moved a few months later. The apartment had been wonderful, but there was no way we could stay in that building after what had happened. Jim and I are still together, and he is just as social with the neighbors, but now we pay closer attention to the elderly people that live in our building. Let me start this story with a little context. I'm a 28-year-old female. I have had what I suppose some would call paranormal instances. Nothing big, just a noise, a voice, something out of the corner of my eye. But I have always chalked it up to my mind playing tricks on me, since I am very paranoid, and nothing has ever been there when I looked. It is also important that I explain the layout of my home. I lived in an old mobile home with my fiancé, one of those ones that look like an actual house. The inside was old, with plywood walls, and an eerie feel to it. Since it's old, it makes a lot of noise, which I'm used to. You enter the home in the laundry room. There is a door frame in front of the entrance with no door attached. When you walk through that frame, to the right is a guest room, and in front is the master bedroom. If you walk to the left, there is a kitchen on your right, and a dining room to the left. Straight ahead is an open, California living room. There is a small wall that covers the view of the kitchen from the living room. We had our TV against that wall, and the couch right in front against the back wall. One night, I was laying on the couch around 2 a.m., as I used to work until 1 a.m., watching TV. All of the lights were off except one lamp that illuminated only the corner of the living room by the couch. I started hearing a noise that sounded like someone was clearing their throat. I knew it wasn't my fiancé, as he was out of town for a bachelor party. I turned down the TV, looked into the dark hallway, and didn't hear or see anything. Then, I started to hear what sounded like footsteps. I once again turned the TV down, and I couldn't see the hallway from where I was laying, so I sat up and looked into the hallway. Nothing. As I started watching TV again, I heard louder footsteps and quickly turned the TV down. The footsteps continued. It sounded like someone was aggressively pacing from the guest room to the kitchen entrance, back and forth. I jumped upright on the couch and stared down the hallway, but, again, didn't see anyone, and the footsteps stopped. I then heard a sound from the kitchen. It was the sound I heard earlier, the sound of someone clearing their throat. It was a deep sound, like a man. Because of the wall, I couldn't see into the kitchen at all, even when sitting up. I was paralyzed with fear sitting upright looking into the hall, and waiting for someone to come out of the kitchen. I kept listening and heard it again, followed by the sound of liquid with ice in a glass, swishing. And then, a loud sipping sound. I jumped up and ran into the bedroom, closed the door, and jumped on my bed. I was still listening. My dog got up out of her bed and walked to the door. She was just staring at it. I called her name, but she didn't move. She didn't even flinch. All of a sudden, I heard loud footsteps coming out of the kitchen and down the hall. There was a scratching sound on the door. Then, the scratching started going along the plywood walls, back down the hallway to the guest room, and back to my room. I can't tell you how many times they went up and down the hallway. The scratching finally stopped, and I heard a low, deep laugh outside the door. The scratching got more intense, and my dog started barking. I told her to stop so that I could hear, but she wouldn't stop. I heard loud running from my door down the hallway to the guest room, and then a loud crash. I jumped up, grabbed my dog, and ran out of the house. I went to my mom's for the night. When I came back in the morning, no one was there, of course. I looked at the wall in the hallway and saw that there were deep scratches on my door, leading down the hallway. It didn't look like scratches a human would make. They were extremely deep and thick, like claws. I went into the guest room and saw that the closet mirror was cracked on the bottom, as if someone had kicked it. I never sat out in that living room at night again, and never had an experience like this again. We have since moved out of that house into a place in the same community, but it is much more updated. It was by far the scariest thing that has ever happened to me, and obviously, I hope it never happens again. When I was 7 years old, I lived on 62nd Street. I had a ton of neighborhood kids that I played with every day, and the days were spent roller skating, riding bikes, and going from house to house playing with all my friends. It was 1981, and my parents were pretty relaxed about letting me leave and be gone all day, until nightfall. I don't remember when I first saw Mr. Hinkle, the old man that lived at the end of the block. But I remember the other kids warning me about him. Make sure never to walk in front of Mr. Hinkle's house. If he sees you, he'll run out and chase you. Mr. Hinkle grabbed me and tried to drag me into his house one time when I was getting my frisbee out of his front yard. Mr. Hinkle is the meanest old man in the world. Mr. Hinkle hates kids. After hearing all this, I was afraid, but I was also intrigued. I wondered if he really was as mean as they'd all said. Would he actually try to chase us? So over time, we all got a bit braver and started to walk in front of his house. Nothing happened the first 4 times we did it, but on the 5th time, I heard the screen door open, and there he was. I see a short, bald, wrinkled old man, holding a wooden cane, raised over his head, shouting at us kids to get off his property. He wasn't fast, but he began to shuffle out the door towards us. I noticed he was wearing slippers, and I was surprised by that for some reason. But then all of us ran as fast as lightning to get out of there. Once we were all the way down the block, we stopped running and began to laugh and talk excitedly about what just happened. It was like seeing Bigfoot or the Wolf Man and outrunning them. Seeing such a feeble and slow old man made us feel that he couldn't do anything to us. So after a couple of days, we decided to up the stakes just a little on our fascination with him. I dare you to knock on Mr. Hinkle's door. This dare went on between all of us kids for about 2 days, before someone was finally brave enough to try it. It was Mikey, the oldest boy of 10. As we all watched from the safety of some bushes across the street, none of us breathed as Mikey crept over to Mr. Hinkle's driveway. My stomach was in my throat as Mikey tiptoed over to the porch and the front door. Just as Mikey reached his arm out to bang on the door, Mr. Hinkle whisked the door open faster than we thought possible and grabbed Mikey by the arm. We heard him shouting at the boy, who was hopping up and down trying to get away. We all screamed and ran in every direction, to each of our houses. I ran so fast, I never looked back. As I rushed in my house, breathlessly telling my mother about the kidnapping I had just witnessed, she clearly didn't believe me, and told me that I should be ashamed of myself for bothering a little old man. I was then forbidden from going down to Mr. Hinkle's house again, and sent to my room. As I sat on my bed, I could only imagine what was happening to Mikey. The next day, as I rode my bike down the sidewalk, there was Mikey. I rushed over to ask him what happened. He dragged me into his house, and he was laughing because I couldn't get away. He had an iron grip on my wrist, but my brothers taught me how to fight, so I kicked him right in the knee and he let me go. He was bent over, so I knew it had to hurt. My mom went and talked to him after I told her what happened. She said she would call the police if we came near his house again, so I'm basically grounded. Wow, me too, I said.